Hello, my name is Garvin, and I read things and chatter about them on the internet for your entertainment. So today we continue our look at the story of Lemuria and its effects now on the people outside of the American European community, most specifically in India. We're going to look at the adoption of the story by the Tamil community, how they used it to reinforce various claims about their culture and their language. Today, we're talking about Kumari Kandam, the legendary lost homeland of the Tamil people, and how that fits in to the story of Lemuria. Now, before I jump into that, let me pull back and give you some context by talking about India itself. Now, at least from my neck of the woods, it's maybe a bit easy to lose sight of how big and diverse India is. I know some folks who, because their only interaction with India is a picture on the map, see it as just one country, so they assume that there's really just one overall language and one overall religion, and, well, that's that. Things are not that simple. Now, there's even an argument of what makes up the historical area of India, because some folks only count the modern nation state of India, while others count India and Pakistan. Some count India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and some even go further, pulling in Nepal, Tibet, and Afghanistan into this huge historical region of India. For this video, though, I'm just going to stick to the modern day borders of the Indian state. We're not going to worry about anything outside of that, okay? And that's because within those modern day borders, there are literally thousands of ethnic or tribal groups, many with histories much older than my own country. I know, some of you are going to say, Garvin, that's easy mode. But a lot of these groups have histories significantly older than the language of English, or even Christianity. And while I'm speaking of religions, there's 4 religions alone that call India their birthplace. There's Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Jainism. I should put an asterisk on that, because now that I've said that there's 4 religions born in India, someone's going to come in with like 10 more I've never heard of. So, 4 religions that I know of. Let's put it that way. On top of those religions, there's also millions of Muslims and Christians and other religions present in India. Little fun fact when it comes to Christianity, the first Christian missionaries arrived in India long before they arrived in England. And let's talk about languages. There are over 60 languages spoken in India with over 100,000 native speakers. Of those 60 languages, 22 are considered major languages, also called regional languages, and they have over 1 million speakers. Tamil is one of those languages, having 69 million native speakers, overall having 77 million people who can speak it at least conversationally. That is a big number, and it's about 6% of India's population. Even Hindi, the largest native language in India, only ranks at about 26% of the population being able to speak it fluently. So when you think of India, do not put this in the same category you would a nation state like Germany or Norway. At least not when you're thinking about its history and its peoples and its languages. Think of it the same way you would think of it as Europe. A large place with many different peoples, with different languages and different histories, who are now more or less politically unified due to, let's say, recent history, all things considered. Veering back to something a little more pertinent to the video here, I want to talk about the main source I'm using, which is the book The Lost Land of Lemuria by Professor Sumati Ramaswamy, who is currently the Distinguished Professor of History at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. The reason she wrote this book is she kept tripping over Lemuria and other stories like it while doing research for her book Passions of the Tongue, Language Devotion in Tamil India, 1891 to 1970. I haven't read that book, but it does sound interesting. So, let's talk about why she kept tripping over Lemuria. To do that, we're going to have to dive a bit into the history of the Tamil people. So today, the Tamils have their own state government within India, and it's the 10th largest state in India by area and the 6th largest by population. It's also an economically successful region of India, the most export competitive state in the country. It's also one of the more literate states in India, and that has one of the more successful education system, at least by any metric I could measure. Culturally, the Tamil people are especially proud of their literary tradition, which is thousands of years old. So, I think today it would be fair to say that the Tamil people are thriving and doing fairly well. But it wasn't always this way. Under British colonial rule, they were often considered lesser than the so-called Aryan groups in northern India. Most British colonial scholars and scientists often rated Southern Indians, or Dravidians as they were called, as less evolved than Northern Indians. This got mixed together with the Tamil tradition that their kingdoms had once been part of a larger whole, but a large part of their old homeland had been devoured by the sea, and because of that they had lost a good portion of their art, history, literature, and other accomplishments. Then Sclater writes his theory of Lemuria in Mammals of Madagascar, and it spreads through the British colonial administration, who passed this idea on to the local elites. And once Haeckel's theories get added to the mix, well, things get interesting in a very Chinese sense. By the way, guys, if you haven't seen the video on Sclater and Haeckel, it's in the Lemurian Spring playlist. I really encourage you to check both those videos out and come back here. But with that, the idea of Lemuria as the cradle of humanity gets spread to the Tamils. And they are very quick to latch onto this idea, stripping out any ideas of the Lemurians being more primitive or lesser than modern Europeans, because that's really not going to do anything for them. They're not interested in being looked down on. They're looking for something to rally around. What scholars and cultural leaders of the Tamil society in the late 1800s and early 1900s do instead is promote this idea that Lemuria is actually the European name for their lost homeland, turning around and seeing, hey, look, European science is validating our tradition. All of this has the backing of Western science. Now, I did mention that the idea of a lost homeland was older than the theory of Lemuria. The earliest mention we have is a 2nd century AD work, whose name I'm just going to put on the screen along with the others here. There's also a 12th century AD work, and there's a list of kings who ruled the drowned land from the 7th century AD. You should see them on the screen right now, and I'm going to put them down in the description as well. Sorry for not trying to pronounce it, but honestly, I think I'm doing the Tamil language a favor by keeping my pronunciation to myself. Moving on, it's not until the 19th century, though, that we see the words Kumari Kandam, and in most of these stories, as I understand it, there's not a claim of a loss of a whole continent, just there was a chunk of land that was drowned by the sea. And sometimes the stories just talk about a single city. Even with that, the name Kumari Kandam would take hold, and that name would gradually overtake and supplant Lemuria in Tamil discourse, perhaps because if you're trying to create a unifying national story, it helps if you don't use names from your foreign oppressors. Just a thought. These cultural leaders and elites don't just restrict this story to themselves, though. They put this story in history books that are made part of general Tamil education. They sponsor contests and art to make this a root belief in Tamil culture, to turn it into a story that unifies them all around this idea of having this great loss of not just land, but of art, science, and the one thing they keep going back to, a great loss of written literature. This is interesting to me because this is the unifying story of their culture, and it's one of lost and exile and becoming less. While it does become a rallying cry to preserve the great works that are left, there still remains this heavy theme of mourning and never to be recovered glory. It creates a story of a Tamil people who are eternally exiled from a homeland they can't even recover physical evidence for. Now, what's particularly interesting is, unlike Atlantis, or American stories of Lemuria for that matter, there's no element of punishment for sins committed or of moral decay. The ocean is cast as a monstrous force, but it's one without a motive. It's unknown. And there's always a sense that the Tamil people did nothing wrong, and there is no understandable reason for the loss of their homeland. Which does add a sense of historical realism, as far as I can determine, sin does not summon natural disasters. History would be a lot different if it did. Now, within this tradition, there are some very different stories about the land of Kumari Kandam, with the only commonality being that this is the lost to the sea homeland of the Tamil people. In one set of stories, it's a land ruled by virtuous queens, and women serve an equal role to men, and this land is a very gender equal, very liberal, free place. In another set of stories, it's a democracy where there is no caste, and the people ruled themselves through assemblies under the advisement of learned men and women. Hopefully listening to that advisement for once. The stories that seem to have the most staying power and are the most widespread, however, are centered around kings of the Tamil people. And these kings can actually be connected to historical dynasties, which may be the reason for that staying power. While these kings are often given great military victories, sometimes conquering from the center of Lemuria up to the very edge of Central Asia, if not further, it's not what they're mainly praised for. Instead, what the stories promote as their greatest deeds are the founding of great academies for the creation of Tamil language and art. And in at least one story, a king is cast as heroic because when the academy he founded is being drowned by the sea, he personally puts himself at great risk to save as many written works as possible before running for his life from the sea. To be fair to him, no one wins a fight with the ocean, so flight was the reasonable course of action here. This would actually happen twice. The kings would found 3 academies, and 2 would be devoured by the sea. And this story would actually be dramatized in a state-funded movie that was shown in 1981. That's how recently the state government was endorsing and supporting this story. Once these stories have taken root, they would grow greater with each telling, until this place is not just the home of the ancient Tamil civilization, but it's now the home of the most ancient human civilization. Tamil is not just the oldest language in South India, but it is the oldest language of humanity, with some enthusiasts declaring it the language of the first real humans. They would also declare that groups like the ancient civilizations of the Near East and the Mediterranean and East Asia were founded by groups of Tamil fleeing the destruction of Lemuria, and they would point to African and Australian natives as fellow descendants of this ancient civilization. And this was used to kind of recast themselves. They are not lower people. They are the rightful heirs to India. The Northern Indians are not a more advanced, more enlightened people. They are late-coming invaders who displaced them from their rightful inheritance. Where Haeckel used the idea of Lemuria to declare them lesser peoples and the British would constantly hold northern Indian groups in higher esteem, the Tamils turned around and said, our descendants from Lemuria is a badge of honor. We are the descendants of the greatest civilization to ever exist on the globe, and so are these other despised groups. A great civilization whose lack of material evidence is conveniently explained by being under the Indian Ocean. Make of that what you will. Now, I can't make any statement to how extensive the belief in Kumari Kandam is in modern-day Tamil culture, if it's even there at all. Given how recently the state government was openly supportive of it, I'm sure that some believe in it, but is it a widespread or majority belief? I couldn't find any reliable sources on that, so I'm not going to make any definitive statements here. It's entirely possible by this point in time, this has become a fringe or mostly discarded belief within Tamil culture, and I just don't know. I will say, I think it's a rather interesting expression of natural feelings, and I do gotta point out, this doesn't seem that much different to me than from when Mr. Lewis, in my Lemurian and the Rosicrucian video, that's also on the Lemurian Spring playlist, guys, claimed California as part of Lemuria, and went on to claim that California had the oldest soil and oldest life on the planet. Mr. Lewis was trying to claim an ancient heritage, not just for himself, but for his fellow Americans. And of course, as part of that, he made the Lemurians look like how he visualized Americans to look. Tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. The Tamil people, in their turn, also claimed Lemuria to give themselves a, more ancient history than what they already had, and made the Lemurians into their ancestors. Although, interestingly enough, when I went looking for any uses of this story by the Tamil Tigers, who were a Tamil separatist group in Sri Lanka, I couldn't find anything. So, the use of this story seems to be confined to the mainland of India, and has been used in a fairly secular and peaceful manner to create a shared identity. So, this does actually kind of reaffirm the commonality of humanity for me, because we all have this urge to have a glorious past that goes farther back than anyone can know, because hopefully that can propel us into a grand and golden future. And maybe one day we'll learn how to do that without cutting each other off at the knees. One day. Maybe one day. But on that somewhat wistful but hopeful note, I think this is a good place to stop for the week. I hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like a voice on what subjects I should cover in future videos, consider joining my Everwise patrons for $1 a month. There's a link in the description below. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to give a special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest supporter. As always, man, thank you very much. Next week, we're going to look at Lemuria in fiction, and we're going to be doing that for a while because I do want to examine the effect of this idea on our own popular culture. So, I've been doing a lot of heavy reading lately, so we're going to start off with comic books, and I'm going to dive into Jack Kirby's Eternals. I hope you join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.